So, welcome everyone. We're delighted to have with us the filmmaker herself, Lila Schmitz. We just finished watching the premiere for us here in the Irish American Heritage Museum of her beautiful film, The Job of Songs, which kind of features some very well-known musicians and singers and some not so well-known maybe, but in the very famous and beautiful Doolin and other towns in County Clare. It was Lila's feature-length directorial debut. She has made a short film called Love in the Time of Corona, which screened at New Fest and at the Palm Springs LGBTQ Film Festival and Desperado LGBTQ Film Festival. So she's an established filmmaker, but we're delighted, Lila, that you're kicking off our series of the Brendan Fahey Beckett filmmaker series. Brendan was unfortunately taken from us too soon. He died in February, aged only 24, and he himself was a beginning filmmaker. So we're very grateful to his parents and family for allowing us to host this film. So thank you, Lila. And I suppose that our first question is, what drew you to make this film, and what in particular about Clare? Is your ancestry from Clare, or where in Ireland?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted that the film is able to make its way to the Irish American Heritage Museum. I'm just thrilled. I was drawn to make this film because of the music and my heritage. My ancestors are from Kerry. I still have family in Kerry. But Clare had always stuck out to me. People said, if you're looking for music, you have to go to Doolin, and this is sort of the place. So I had been there before. I traveled to Ireland with my family to meet relatives and travel around, and we went to some of these sessions, and I was just totally drawn in. And the first session that I stepped into, I was just sort of struck by this feeling that came from the music and the communal aspect of it, and I couldn't explain what the feeling was. And so I had in the back of my mind for years this idea of trying to capture that feeling that I had no words for. And when I was graduating from college, from university, I had the opportunity to apply for a grant to make a short documentary film, and I collected my two favorite people to make films with, who I went to school with, and we applied for the grant and got it, and went to Ireland and just started shooting with not a lot of preparation or sort of dictated story. And we very naturally met everybody, and sort of, we would have an interview and somebody would say, oh, you have to talk to this person. And so I think the film shows that feeling also, which was really came from us navigating through this world that way, of this sort of interconnected piece. We were on that journey, just like the film goes on.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a Kerry woman, I have to say that's fantastic. I'm from the Stole myself, so that's great.
My family's from Tralee.
Oh, good. It's only 17 miles over the road, yeah.
And Castle Island as well, I would be.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, and the Stole was mentioned in the film, actually, because
yes,
there's a lot of work in the 80s, to kind of resuscitate the flacioles. So I suppose that, did you find it difficult? One of the themes that comes up in the movie is like, the isolation that's sometimes involved in Doolin and the insularity. Did you find that the community of musicians were willing to speak to you, or, did you have to kind of butter them up? How long did it take to get on their good side,
Absolutely. I think that they're not used to, opening up and necessarily speaking, especially to an outsider, which you can tell I am just by my accent and everything else. But I was curious, and when I was first there, it was just myself and Annika Congrevstad, who was the director of photography and also a producer on the film. And we were there for the first 2 weeks, just the two of us, before our third producer, Fungi, came to join us. Mm-hmm. But we just spent a lot of time in pubs, not necessarily filming, but just sort of being present. And we might have a camera with us, but not necessarily shoot, because a lot of it was just trying to gain trust and trying to make sure that people were comfortable, because we you know, being new filmmakers and first time feature filmmakers, young women coming out of school, both of us had just graduated. I think we really were trying to figure out how to navigate that and be respectful of, you know, that world. So we went in and slowly, you know, through interviews, which were more like chats, we started to gain people's trust, and I think people had a good time speaking to us, and you know, the interviews were just really these sort of like what often ended up being deep conversations about life and music and what that means, and I think that the musicians acknowledged that I was just curious about it. And like even in the film, Luca Bloom grandmother, and he's talking about my grandmother, you know, because I was talking about her, and he says, you know, so I think there's something very intimate about that. But no, I would say it's a hard nut to crack, and we were lucky that they took a chance on us.
Yeah. Well, and you know, you said rightly, some people actually did, you know, expose is a bit cruel maybe, or you know, too much, but some people really were vulnerable with you and told you honestly, you know, talking about drink or despair and depression and suicide. So, you know, it's a community that probably goes through a lot, I would say, of maybe very similar stories, but without ever articulating it together explicitly, which is one of the reasons I think why the music is so important to them, because again and again, they kind of say music allows them to express it or process it without actually having to have a conversation. So, you know, did you find that like that there was, you know, did some of them get emotional? Did you have to kind of stop filming sometimes? How did that all work?
Absolutely. Well, I think first and foremost, I find art to be something that is healing for me, and I am not a musician, but I love to sing, and I always have loved to be immersed in music, and I love film for music and how you can deal with sound. And so I find a lot of solace in that and the communities that are formed around it. So I had this personal connection, which I think helps to be able to talk to people about it that way, and not come from a place of judgment or outsiderness. You know, I think I tried not to dig to I was very intentional about not trying to expose anything that would be you know, detrimental for the community or painful, but also trying to tell an honest story and share the maybe darker, truer sides of what is happening. And it was a very thin line to walk, and not trying to step on toes, even in the edit after, you know, we got the interviews. But we were really lucky that Katie Thiesby, who is in the, you know, you've seen the film, who is really this strong presence and very open about her struggles with alcoholism and depression, and how the music has been this restorative, just life-saving lifeline. I think she was just open. She just is open. She's really a great advocate from, you know, my experience, and just seeing her, you know, on Facebook, and like being very open about things that are hard to talk about. And she says in the film something about like, if we can talk about depression and just say, you know, it's all right that you feel like that, plenty of others feel like that. And I started crying in the interview, and you know, I was not digging for that, but I was having a tough day already, and I was like, oh God, how am I gonna be able to have this interview and do a good job with her? I didn't know her at all. We met maybe once before that, barely.
Wow.
And she just really opened up this world in a way that was so beautiful and transparent. And then the other folks who contribute to that are, it's so meaningful to hear the different versions of people's experience. And I think, you know, you have the older Christy Berry talking about the weather and how that can be kind of tough, but it's a completely different approach to this same exact feeling and topic, because all of them are going through their individual lives and have these connecting pieces, but really on their own path to get there. And so, yeah.
And it was such a the community, it seems so kind of contradictory at times, because they are so inclusive. They were very welcoming, obviously, and forthcoming with you. And yet, the one guy is saying, I've only been here 40 years. So there's this sense too of, local versus blow-in.
Yes.
And yet they're all musicians in it together. So that's probably a community within a community. How do those layers become obvious to you while you're there, or are they not as important actually? It's a bit tongue in cheek to call somebody, only 40 years.
I think that everyone feels a little isolated. Maybe that's a blanket statement, but I think that that is something that really, I came in with my own baggage and feeling this sort of, just looking at the community, you see these sort of sweeping landscapes that are just empty and beautiful, but it is this harsh natural world, and it's even colder in the winter, and they've had winter storms where they can't go outside, and this was pre-COVID that we shot. So this was before everyone was sort of thinking and talking about isolation. I went in with that question of like, is there this communal piece within this very isolated world? And I think so. Yes, there are all these things that make people feel isolated in themselves, like, oh, I've only been here 40 years and feeling like that, but they're all able to come into this space and join in together. And I was just fascinated by that, because I think I they talk about coming together and the importance of it, and I think that struck me as the magic of what they're doing more so. And it has only increased with lockdowns and other people joining into this sort of line of thought, but that was forefront of my mind for sure.
I wonder, COVID must have been horrific on them then, because Ireland had very strict lockdowns, in terms of bars being closed and gathering and older people cocooning. Have you talked to them since, like, were they doing a Zoom session or anything like that?
They were able to do live streams, but that's not the same.
No, absolutely not. The magic of being together with the music.
Right. It was hard. It was really hard. I saw that the hotel was delivering food to the elderly who couldn't go out and get food, and so there was support going on, but it was tough. It was a very lonely space, and they were doing things on the internet and performing on live streams and chatting that way, but it was not easy, as it has not been for a lot of people. But I have seen them, and we got to go this summer to Ireland to premiere internationally at the Galway Film Fleadh, which was amazing, and we actually won Best International Documentary, which was such an honor. And the most of the people in the film got to come up to the premiere, and then we went to Doolin and had a completely filled to the brim, way past sold out screening, which was really lovely and fun. And they really felt seen by the film and liked it, which was something I was so nervous and worried about, and had spent years trying to make sure that was the case, and we got that affirmation. So it was just beyond delightful.
And Lila, you made very interesting choice, I suppose, as a filmmaker. Now that we're talking like this, where you said you came into it with your own baggage, you're actually not really present in the film. Like, we don't hear your voice asking the questions. And that kind of just struck me now as we were talking, that even though obviously it's it's your work and through your eyes, did you deliberately keep yourself out of it, or talk to me about that process?
Yeah, I mean, I never intended to be a part of the film. I think it's more interesting to me that it's about them and their community. And there maybe were moments where I thought that my personal ancestry draw and story would have fit in, but I'm glad that it stayed this way. I think it's harder to keep yourself out of it because it's harder to sort of weave it together so that it makes sense and all of that. But I think it was worth it just to keep the focus on the musicians. I mean, we had interviews like with patrons or people who've been magnetically drawn to Doolin who maybe don't live there all the time and are musicians, or do live there and aren't musicians. So I had spoken to those people as well, and we ended up having to just figure out how to narrow down and like make it sort of a cohesive piece with the essential pieces that were the most important. And so it was a lot of just slicing and dicing to tell the best story, and years of trying to figure that out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you did a great job. I think one of the things that struck me, of course, as a historian, but too, listening to, you know, your own consciousness of your ancestry, and then Irish people at home, like who maybe got left at home, but they're conscious that other people in their, you know, larger group have gone, and people like Luca Bloom, even, you know, who maybe left for a while and came back. This theory of immigration, you know, kind of looms large over the film, or leaving and coming and belonging. Did you know going into it that that would be central, you know, or is this just something that kind of came up organically?
It came up organically. That was something that I started to notice in the interviews. People would just sort of mention emigration and colonization off the cuff, like just in passing. And it came up so much that I was like, oh, this is really important. Because so I think just listening and following what people were telling me, and not explicitly, but just sort of starting to learn from them what was important. And because my main question was like, what is this thing? What is this feeling that I feel when I walk into these? Why is this happening? And they're sort of like, oh, that's a good question. I don't really know. And they start to talk and they start to think about it. And that always came up, and that always came to the forefront. And so I think that they just in a lot of ways dictated the story, because they were the ones who understand way better than I do what's happening. And but I thought it was fascinating that these histories of emigration and famine and colonization are so strong in just daily conversation and life, and that felt really impactful, especially with such a, you know, such a sensitive crowd as they call themselves, and really feeling this past heavy.
Yeah. I think one of them, it might have been oh, I forget who, what she said, like we're empathetic, you know, and so there's this idea of musicians and singers maybe like channeling the grief of the community or the loss of the community, and I thought it was such a moving bit where that the man wrote the piece for his brother like 25 years after the death, you know, and said, I didn't know I was crying, but there was tears, you know. That was very, very powerful. You know, I suppose when you talk about like that, the rural depopulation and even the suicides, and particularly I think in Clare, because a lot of strangers go there to commit suicide. It's not just their own community. You know, there's the Cliffs of Moher are infamous for sometimes accidents and sometimes not. Do you think that kind of grief or like tragedy in the locale impacts them separate again, like from their own internal angst, you know?
Um, that's a great question. I don't know, first of all, I have to say that, but my feeling is that based on what Katie talks about in this need to talk about it, and my personal experience with this sort of passed down Irish heritage feeling of don't talk about it, and keep things inside the Catholic. I think that there I think there is room to grow as a community, which can help the individual, and that is within having these conversations and supporting each other in ways that maybe, you know, are hard, especially if you come from a very sort of silent world about the deep emotional parts of it. But yeah, I do think that it helps to have conversations and on a broader basis than just the individual.
Well, and just, as we're talking now, obviously you've been probably watching the news in Ireland, all the stories coming out about Blackrock College, and which, I'm not claiming that they're related, but this idea of, it's such a dichotomy, I think, for Irish people. We're very, very vocal, like we talk a lot. Our songs are incredibly sad. There's anger about colonization. So, and they say that like the songs are a way to express it, and yet maybe we're not having the actual conversation, or there is this silence, like don't talk about that, don't tell. So everyone knew about mother and baby homes, or about the dodgy priest, but you don't articulate it, and yet you cannot keep it in. So it finds, being able to express it through music, even if it's not the exact same thing, but being able to express pain through music is obviously incredibly important for everyone in Ireland, not just the actual musicians,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The people who come to listen, as Luca Bloom says, who know every tune, like it's in their DNA. Yeah, absolutely. I think the music is so fascinating because it becomes sort of this first step in talking about it, and obviously not explicitly but emotionally, which to me is the most interesting. And but yeah, there's definitely room to grow.
Yeah, well, and it was interesting too that Anne was talking about like her friend who used the words of one of the immigrants, one of the refugees, to write this song, a protest song, basically. So it's interesting that our activism even is around issues that maybe don't necessarily affect Irish people, because it was about direct provision and refugees. So it's this needing a third party maybe to mediate some of the more difficult topics, and yet there's this drive for social justice and for inclusion and for help, that I think is very interesting in that community.
Right. And what I think is so interesting about Anne, because a lot of the songs that she sang for us are protest songs and about a whole variety of different issues, but she was a leader in the gay rights marches. She was a leader in the pro-choice marches. Like she has done, and she comes to that through the music. And I think it really struck me because of this feeling of like bringing herself and her fight into her music and her songs, and that was how she uses it and how she sort of heals and it grows from this music. So it definitely is, to the individual, but comes out in all these ways of starting to express what's important to them personally.
And the interesting thing too about Anne, but also the film in general, there was this sort of idea about, the transference of the knowledge. Maybe people don't actually read music, or, the dad shouting in the window, you're playing it wrong, but not showing him how. And Anne was in her 60s, when she decided to learn. And so, and yet you see that other, like the little kid, practicing with her parents or grandparents. And so, this idea that age maybe isn't, important, but also I kind of think it ties into the evolution of Ireland as well, that Ireland has changed so much, like in the last 20 years, even, as you mentioned, the LGBTQ thing and the pro-choice, so they, particularly Anne's generation, I think, have seen so much change that they were maybe at the forefront of leading as well as just describing.
Right.
Did any of them talk about that in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think even with this sort of like conversation around women being more present in the music, and this idea that women stay at home and take mind the kids, and the man can just pick up his guitar box and go, good luck, I'm out the door, and he's gone. Like she has to make arrangements, that's Katie. I think they're talking about it and they're thinking about it, and everyone is aware, and I think wants to do better. And it's in that way, I think, they're trying within this
Mhm.
community, and that's
Mhm.
that's something that's really great. And
Well, that
they meant,
awareness, I suppose, is key to the change, you know. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Um, and so actually you mentioned earlier on too the landscape. I said there, like the shots of some of it, you know, the light is so amazing and how stark the landscape is. I mean, I'm from Kerry, not quite the ring of Kerry, but it's very beautiful, you know, where I
Yeah.
am. But you forget too that there are huge parts of the country like that are a bit desolate, you know. And I personally, like, I don't love that, you know, like I find that landscape very lonely, very um it kind of challenging, to be honest. You know, like people go on about Clifton and the Burren, you know, and I find that actually very challenging. You know, it's too awesome in that sense of the word, like that. But the landscape is almost a character in the film. Did you always see that? Like, are you a visual filmmaker sort of thing before you're a talking one? If you get me, you know, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am certainly not visual before emotional, but
Mm.
I had the great opportunity to work with Annika, who shot the film, and we sort of wrote up the initial proposal together. And it was always clear to me, and with her help, like this idea of juxtaposing the vast landscape with the very small tight-knit pubs and sort of these like greens and blues that you get versus the oranges inside. And that was part of the initial pitch. There wasn't a lot in it because I was sort of like, we're gonna go capture a feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
um,
We don't know what the feeling is. Yeah.
yeah. And they
Yeah.
were like, you're gonna what? Like,
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
but but that was always very clear to me because I
Mm.
think it is such a beautiful place, and it does feel like you're talking about, I think, challenging to
Mm.
be in that. And even the cliffs being sort of this backdrop to this place, and the tourism being this sort of interesting, like often neglectful way of approaching it,
Mhm.
just in this sort of like fast tourism industry where
Intrusiveness, kind
people,
of, yeah.
right,
Yeah.
where I think they're missing a lot of what's there. And that I think is more an example of daily life that is not
Mm-hmm.
specific to this place. That's this
Mm-hmm.
idea that Luca Bloom talks about of you know, we I can't remember if this is in the film. I think it is, where he talks about like we used to wait for we used to wait for a record. We would order it at the store. Maybe this isn't in the film, but he talks about we would order the record at the store and wait a month and then get it and listen to it nonstop, and like have this sort of like waiting be this part
Mm-hmm.
of life that we
Mm-hmm.
don't experience so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
um and yeah, I think it all plays into it. But to the landscape, I think, yeah, just this idea of the sort of wide green, um very lonely space that these intimate, like small, very close knit, orange warm places lit by
Mm-hmm.
candlelight, like that was, I think, just metaphorically a really strong piece that drew me into it.
Mm-hmm. And then your two, I hadn't thought about this until you mentioned them, but your two fellow filmmakers,
Yes.
Annika and I don't know the other.
Funny.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
not Irish, I imagine. You know,
No, neither
yeah.
of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Annika is American and Fungy's Chinese, and we went to college together. And the film was my idea, but they were willing to hop on with this sort of
Yeah.
crazy plan.
But they had never been like before, even Annika helped you write the proposal. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I showed them pictures and some videos, and they were like, "Okay,
Yeah.
I'll go to Ireland."
Yeah.
Like,
But you know,
and
it might have
yeah,
been kind of helpful to have a complete outsiders, you know, like it, because
yes,
you're half in, half out in one way, you
yeah,
know, if you think you've got this ancestry and you'd already visited and stuff. But for complete strangers and who are so like culturally different from
right.
Ireland or Irish America, it was probably good to have that kind of objectivity, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah, you know,
absolutely. I
yeah.
think it helped. I mean, even like in editing the film,
Mm,
Feng Yi was an assistant editor, and Annika helped me edit like the film you see.
Yeah.
And she was a great sort of partner in just looking at it and being like, what makes sense? And I think because to me, there's always the question of audience, and I wanted it to play well in Ireland, and I wanted people in the film to like it, maybe even love it and feel seen. But I also really wanted to be able to show it to a random friend of mine who has no connection and can understand why I spent 5 years of my life doing it, like
Wow,
I
yeah.
think that is something that was always important, and having their perspective and having very just different worlds that they're coming from, and they both fell in love with it pretty immediately, which
Okay.
it's hard not to, but I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that was important too, and they both understood what was beautiful about it, and
Okay.
now are completely immersed, and like we went to Doolin, and Annika said to me, it is so strange to have this like home away from home in Ireland with people that like I know and love and feel like I could come back here. Like, and just it is such a strange thing that we have. And it's really speaks to the people there and the place. Yeah. Yeah.
And actually talking about that too, so you went not really knowing, you wanted to capture a feeling, I think you said, which was in your head, was the feeling, the communalness of sharing music together, and then that kind of shifted or not as you filmed, or like what did you think you were doing, and then as you were doing it, did that change?
Sure. The feeling was the feeling of a session, of being the first session that I was in. I just remember sitting there with my mom, and who is Irish, and just being sort of overcome by this feeling of these people sitting there playing together, this man leading the session sitting next to another man who he's played with for 40 years every Sunday night for every single year of their relationship, and then this young woman coming in and sitting down, and they've never met, and she joins in and she plays the songs that she knows, and they and then dances and sings a song, and like they all share this common knowledge. And I think that's something that I was so drawn to, for the idea of like strangers being able to share in something. And yeah, how did it change? I mean, I think I just learned a lot more about what was happening there. Firstly, like we talked about with the immigration and colonialism, I didn't realize how present that was as a concept in people's minds, and sort of shaping why this was such an important practice. Historically, even I think the music was written down first in the United States, because people carried it with them, unlike the language, like Christy McNamara says in the film. Yeah, it just getting in much deeper, and like my love for it did not wane at all. So I think it just has grown in a different way. And
well, it's amazing. You said that was one of my questions. Are you a musician? And you said no, but a singer. But I think maybe Irish people maybe take it for granted a little bit, whether they're performers themselves or not. Like there's always a session in my hometown,
Right.
in John B. Keane's pub, my local at home. Whether you're kind of good or not, you're asked to sing a song or recite a poem, or and so I think we might actually not realize ourselves how important this kind of is, because it's almost, and I think it might be particularly true for the children or descendants of immigrants, that like, oh, this is what my great grandmother might have done, or
Right.
and so to be present at that must be kind of thrilling, really, in a way.
Yeah. Definitely. And I mean, I feel that my life is missing something like that. Like I think it's this feeling um of not having something to share in sort of like this weekly community space. I live in a very busy city in Los Angeles, and I have, great friends and all of that.
Mhm.
But I think there's something really special about coming together around something that's almost spiritual and like unifying in this way that is missing in I can speak for myself in my life often, but I think
Mhm.
it's a broader piece. And so that was something that came to the forefront of my mind while making this, and is just fascinating to me, is sort of
Yeah.
like what do we replace our this sort of communal, like this thing that has been filled by spiritual practice, or in their case music, or like I think some sort of community piece that is maybe worth more effort to look for than we give it credit for. Is
Mhm. And
Yeah.
Luca Bloom says that too, that we're in this, he says we're complicit in a race to what, and I had to write that down. I just thought that was so striking, that everything we think, is accomplishable or is important to get, all of this accumulating, of things is maybe not what's important. And so I think when you described your first session, really that's the idea of being 100% present at something, like in the moment,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
just got chills. Yeah,
But yeah,
definitely.
it's true. So all of I thought your film was beautiful, to come out with these things.
Thank you.
Um so, and I was also kind of glad you don't dwell on the negativity, and maybe that's Katie and all these other people, who told their story. There is forward movement, there is an awareness around the problems, and maybe, this hope that there's a way to deal with them. So
Yeah,
it is kind of uplifting in the end too.
that was really important to me, and
Mhm.
continues to be in any storytelling, because I think hope is almost all we've got.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I hope to leave people that way, because I think that's the way that we move forward and
Absolutely,
keep
yeah.
going. There's
Well,
always hope. There
there
is
is,
always
there is, you know. And so, are you working on anything at the moment, Lila, or what can we hope to hear from you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to make this film available.
Mhm.
That's part of my situation, but I am working on some scripted projects. One is set in Ireland and about, heritage and intergenerational relationships, and trying to figure out what is next that way. But I think I'm gonna work on scripted, something like, a narrative film, and maybe come back to documentary later on, but branch out a little and
Okay,
just keep
good.
going.
Yeah. Well, we're delighted that we had the opportunity to show it here, and I wish you the best of luck with it. Hopefully, some of the other film festivals will pick it up, and you should definitely bring it to the FLA people.
Yes,
Um,
yes. Well, thank you so much
yeah,
for sharing it.
not at all. Yeah, we're absolutely thrilled. So
Yay.
I'll just end the recording.